Hi! So we're going to talk about gender, sex, and sexuality. And while your textbook gives a pretty good introduction to the concepts of gender, sex, and sexuality, because this is part of my PhD work, I'm going to give you even more of, hopefully, a thorough understanding of these concepts that hopefully you can take with you. And if this is your first introduction to really studying these concepts academically, hopefully it will make you look at these concepts and how they play out in your everyday life a little bit differently. So here we have a picture. I always like to sort of start off a lecture with a little bit of some sort of humor. And we start off with a kind of gender difference that I am often confronted with in my sort of world playing video games, where we have this warrior type person. I'm not sure if she's a mage, if she's a warrior, if she's a rogue, whatever sort of class she is in the game. She is from, I believe, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, and this is a depiction of what armor is supposed to look like on this female character. Now, I say the word armor, and I'm not entirely sure what the game's definition of armor, but my understanding of armor is that it's supposed to protect you in battle from getting killed. And I can identify a variety of places where an enemy can very much hack this poor woman to shreds. Her heart is completely exposed. Her neck is at least covered, but not completely. Her belly is totally exposed. Her side, one of the sort of major femoral arteries there is exposed. You could probably take out a kidney, a couple of kidneys there, right? And she's also wearing high heels, which, depending on the terrain in which she's fighting, is not exactly the most practical thing in the world. Now, if you've been playing video games as long as I have, you might have a tendency to sort of take these depictions of women for granted, as we will learn later when we visit video games specifically in our media and technology lecture. A lot of these images are commonplace and pretty much taken for granted, and you don't really sort of notice kind of how silly that sort of this whole armor concept is until it is flipped. And so we see a guy kind of showing off what would happen if men wore armor the same way that women are usually given armor in video games and other sort of fantasy type settings, right? So on this guy, it looks absolutely ridiculous, right? Everything is exposed except for certain particular bits, right? And it looks ridiculous on him, and yet we accept it on her, right? And so oftentimes when you think about throughout our, throughout the course of this lecture, when you think about things like gender roles, try to imagine what would happen if these things were flipped and what they would look like. Oftentimes, it might be, kind of a little bit of a shock to the system, but you realize sort of how heavily gender is embedded into a lot of the things we do, but we'll get into that. So, what do you think the relationship is between sex, gender, and sexual orientation? Do you think that they are directly influential? They dictate each other? They're all pretty much one and the same? Or are these completely separate entities? And I'll give you a little moment to think about it. Think. Well, the answer is B. Now, while we do talk about all of these things together, right? I mean, we're talking about all of these things together in one lecture. Sex is not gender, it is not sexuality. These things do not dictate each other. Just because you are a specific gender does not dictate your sexuality. Your sexuality is not dictated by your sex, etc., etc. And we'll sort of get into a theoretical history of how it was that we even thought these three things to be separate, right? Because at first, you might be looking at even the lecture title and saying, well, I actually didn't know that these three things were sort of separate terms really in the first place. So hopefully you have a better understanding of the way sort of things work in terms of sex, gender, and sexuality. Now, one sort of way to kind of think about things is in colors. One of the probably the first signifiers of gender is color, right? If you look at a baby, you can probably identify what they are based on the color that they're wearing or the kind of clothes. I mean, babies generically kind of all look the same when they're infants, right? And so a lot of times clothing, and especially the color, is definitely a marker of what the child is. So think about this. Look at these sort of two pairs of words and see if you can figure out which one of these is correct. Give you a moment. Now, if you have been sort of socialized in the last, if you have sort of been socialized into kind of mainstream American society, you might think that this sort of set of words would probably look the most proper. Pink for girls, blue for boys, rather than blue for girls and pink for boys. And you'd be forgiven for thinking so. But what if I told you that the correct answer depended on what year I was asking the question? Pink for girls and blue for boys is actually a relatively recent phenomenon when it comes to human recorded history in the Western world. In fact, it wasn't until about the 1930s that pink for girls and blue for boys was the sort of established standard that carried its way to not only clothing, but also things like toys. Before the 1930s, babies would generically wear either white or this color configuration. Blue was considered a softer, more feminine color, while pink was considered a color that was more sort of active and vigorous and passionate, right? And therefore more masculine. Kind of interesting, right? So, this is only one example of the different ways in which we can think of gender as something that is not necessarily set in stone, but oftentimes is kind of dictated by socialization. So if we remember how important agents of socialization are, from your primary socialization as a kid, your parents, your caretakers, all of these significant others are teaching you not only very important messages about what it is to be a good person within society, but very specifically, they're also teaching you how to be a good girl or a good boy. And a lot of times this involves wearing either pink or blue. So, while your textbook does give you a really, really good introduction, I think you would be very well served by knowing a little bit more about how we sort of got to this point in thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality as separate things. So, this is kind of how we started off. We started off with sex, and sex was just one big term that described your biology. It described the way that you behaved. It described who you are attracted to and who you have sexual relationships with. It described all those things. Those things weren't necessarily treated as separate entities. If you were born a woman, then your gendered life was pretty much already dictated for you. You have a certain set of behaviors, you have a certain set of jobs that are appropriate for you, and you have pretty much only one option in terms of what to do with your life, which was pretty much get married to a dude and pop out some kids. And because being a mother is the thing that you're meant to do. And all of this is determined by your biology. And therefore, sex was really the only word that we needed. And this is, of course, kind of like Victorian era, up until maybe the 1960s and 70s when we really start examining on a sort of theoretical and academic level the differences between biology and other stuff. So let's go there. So thanks to the second wave of US feminism, right, the sort of women's rights movement, and the introduction of women's studies programs, we really start seeing a more close examination of the differences between biology, behavior, and attraction. And in order to describe those better, we have sex, which at this point now only is used to describe biology. We're talking ovaries, we're talking testicles, we're talking chromosomes, XX, XY, all of that stuff. That is pure biology. Then we have gender, and gender is used to describe everything else in terms of behavior. And these can be things like, gender performance. These are things like the toys that you're socialized to play with, the jobs that society tells you that are appropriate for you to have, whether you are considered masculine, whether you're considered feminine. All of those things are sort of lumped in under gender. And then sexual orientation is treated completely separately, and this is specifically for attraction and sexual desire. And that was actually pretty good for us theoretically for a while. Getting even closer to the present, sort of in, kind of like mid to late 1990s, let's just stick it there for fun, we start to see an even more nuanced description of the way things sort of work. So we have sex, which is still used to describe biology, your chromosomes, your primary and secondary sex characteristics, etc. And then we have gender identity. Gender identity works at the point of personal identification, whether you yourself identify as a man, as a woman, or there are actually plenty of other terms out there, including things like non-binary gendered or even genderqueer. And we'll get into some of those sort of terms and differences in a bit. Then we have gender expression. And gender expression is not the point of identity, it is at the point of outward performance of gender. And then this is where all of this stuff regarding things like, skirts versus pants, makeup, grooming habits, clothing choices, toy choices, job opportunities, all of those things that encompass your performance of gender, that is where gender expression falls. And then we still have sexual orientation, because I guess if it ain't broke, then, don't fix it. Now, the only difference now is that we have changed sex and just added one word, assigned sex. And this refers to the fact that when you are an infant, you are not necessarily capable of asserting your own identity. At this point, you cannot sort of say, I am a man, I am a woman. Pretty much at this point of infancy, all you can say is, I'm hungry, or I need to pee. So, putting the term assigned sex there refers to the idea that you do not determine your sex. Your sex is determined for you by a team of doctors and parents and caretakers at birth or even through prenatal examinations, right? It is the doctors and it is the parents. These are the people that end up sort of checking the box in the hospital and trying to determine what it is that you are. Nature has an infinite amount of variety, and this assigned sex accounts for the fact that this infinite variety in the ways that that genitals can look at birth, different combinations of chromosomes and hormones that can arise, the presence of different kinds of primary or secondary sex characteristics. There is an infinite possibility of combinations of how these things can pop up. And there are specific definitions of what it is to be male and what it is to be female that doctors and parents use to check that box when you were born, right? And these are often more narrow definitions of what it is to be considered male and what it is to be considered female. These are often narrower definitions than and they don't necessarily allow for the kind of infinite variety that nature can produce, right? So this is why we add the term assigned to sex, because it is not a biological inevitability. Things like this can actually be decided for you by doctors and parents based on a long medical history of assumptions of what it is to be properly male or properly female. So that actually points to the idea that sex itself is not some sort of biological scientific fact. In fact, sex has a bit of social kind of construction and social influence added in there too. And then we keep the gender identity, which is the point of personal identification, gender expression, which is the sort of outward expression of yourself, and then sexual orientation, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So for all of you visual learners, this is kind of a way, it's a bit flawed, it's a bit flawed, but this is probably one of the best introductory depictions of these concepts that I can find. There are way more in-depth kind of diagrams and stuff, but since this is an Intro to Sociology class, we don't have to be necessarily as thorough at this point, but if you are doing research on it, then you can feel free to ask me and we can dive even more in depth later. But for now, this will sort of do. And this little genderbread person, it's not a gingerbread person, but it's a genderbread person, basically highlights where it is that all of the different elements that we just talked about occur. Identity is in the brain. It is your own sort of personal identification in terms of gender. Gender expression is all of these sort of outward performance of gender. Your attraction is at the point of the heart, who it is that you are attracted to, who it is that you desire. And sex is all of the stuff that has to do with biology. And of course, we have added to this diagram assigned sex, right? So the diagram is a bit flawed, it's not incredibly updated, there are all sorts of other issues with it, but for now this might be one of the best ways to sort of visually depict these concepts. So on the right, we have this idea that basically humans have an infinite variety of possibilities, and especially when it comes to identity expression, assigned sex, and attraction, there are infinite varieties that are available, and definitely infinite combinations. So think of these concepts not as an either-or. You are either male or either female. You are either straight or gay. You are either masculine or feminine. You can think of these options as two extremes on a big spectrum of possibilities. So when it comes to gender identity, it can be the degree to which you identify as a woman, the degree to which you identify as a man, or other possibilities exist, like you perhaps identifying as not maybe having a gender at all. You can identify as a woman, you can identify as a man, maybe two-spirit, genderqueer, or genderless, right? And there are many, many more possible terms that can fit. But the sort of binary terms that we are most familiar with is basically just saying, I am a man, I am a woman. Those are probably maybe more common identifications, or probably, if anything, the identifications that you might be the most familiar with at this point. Gender expression, on the other hand, is the degree to which you can express yourself as masculine, feminine, or perhaps none of the above. So this is where you might see different kinds of gender expression performances, like somebody who could perform in a more sort of butch way, somebody who's maybe a little bit more femme, somebody who is androgynous or gender neutral, or maybe hyper masculine, maybe hyper feminine. If you have ever known anybody who might have been, for example, considered a tomboy, right? Then this sort of tomboyness would fall under the heading of gender expression. Then we have our assigned biological sex, and then there is the degree to which we can be considered male, the degree to which we can be considered female. There is a possibility of asex or intersex, female self-identification, male self-identification, and intersex would be the term that would be used to describe people that may have before been called hermaphrodites, might have been that sort of have a combination of perhaps male and female primary or secondary sex characteristics, but because of these sort of different kinds of combinations that can arise, intersex is more of a wider umbrella term to do that. And then there is attraction, right? So you can be attracted to men, to identified men. You can be attracted to sort of assigned males. You could be attracted to the expression of masculinity. Or you could be attracted to women, females, femininity. You can also be attracted to nobody. And depending on where you fall in that spectrum, you could be considered straight, or heterosexual. You could be gay, homosexual, pansexual, where at this point it doesn't necessarily matter what gender expression is being used. It's all about the person. You could be bisexual, where you enjoy, to different degrees, of course, as you sort of hold binary gender and you like people that perhaps fit into kind of traditional binary gender roles, but you like them both, and you can like them both to different degrees. Maybe you like them both, but you like women a little bit more than men, or vice versa. Or you could be asexual, where you can have very close friendships and very close relationships, but you do not necessarily have a physical desire for sex. And so you're not sexually attracted or even emotionally attracted in terms of dating to any of them, right? So to review, the terms that we can use, these sort of binary terms, the either or, if we had to use only two boxes, which hopefully you learned in that past slide that there are way more than two available boxes. But if we had to use two boxes, these would be the two boxes, the two categories that are most associated to the different terms that we just described. So sex is assigned biologically based characteristics, and the terms that we would use are male and female. Gender identity is your self-identification, and that would be man and woman. Gender expression is all about your performance of gender, where the binary here is masculine and feminine. And your sexuality, or your sexual orientation, that would be your attraction, or not, to another person. And a million terms apply here, but the more common ones that we just mentioned are like heterosexual, homosexual, straight, gay, asexual, bisexual, pansexual, etc. Okay? Cool. So let's review. Gender is a social construction, and gender is also a performance. So what we're going to do is we are going to pause here to let you digest that a little bit more. And then when we come back in part 2, we will get into a little bit more of not only the social construction of gender, but also the social construction of sex, and what happens when you may be assigned biologically one sex, but your identification is different. What happens when you are transgender, for example. So take all of this in, review, and we will see you next time on Gender, Sex, and Sexuality, Part 2.